Okay, first, you sit next to your front door for 2 days waiting while T-Mobile takes its sweet time bringing you your new iPhone. But then you get to unbox your new iPhone and see that cool hello screen. After you get through all that nonsense about privacy and the useless Siri crap, you get to the home screen. And then you get to see all the apps that Apple wants you to have. One of them is Apple News, which is preloaded on every iPhone sold in the United States. You didn't download it, you didn't ask for it. One day it was just there, and because it was there, and because the interface is that clean Apple style, you tried out. The sources look familiar enough that most people assume that the app is doing what Apple said it's gonna do, surface the news neutrally. But is it? For 100 consecutive days, from October of last year through February of this year, Apple News featured 0 articles from right-leaning outlets in its morning top stories. Not a few, not underrepresentation, absolutely 0. When that number became public and the FTC sent a warning letter, Apple's response was to add 8 right-leaning articles in February, out of 570. 8 out of 570 roughly translates to 1.4%. Could you have done less, Apple? They announced that as progress, but here's the thing. The bias in their app isn't the trap. The trap is that Apple built this entire system and told you the bias was the solution. They looked at what Facebook and Google were doing, computer-based algorithmic feeds that rewarded outrage, spread misinformation, surfaced the most inflammatory content because that's what engagement optimizes for, and they said, we're going to fix that with humans. Responsible humans, trained journalists, people who care about accuracy. And then they hired 30 editors almost exclusively from legacy outlets like the New York Times, New York Magazine, and the Washington Post. Then they gave them editorial control over what 125 million people see every morning. The bias didn't sneak in, it was part of the architecture. Most people consuming Apple News, which they probably pay for, have never thought about any of this. The app has a nice, clean design. The sources are familiar and they look credible. They absorb the feed and build their understanding of the world on top of that fake, one-sided structure. They never once ask who decided what goes in there or why. But if you're here, you've probably already felt something like that question forming. And today we're going to name it. And we're going to name something else too, the trap that got sprung on the people who are most upset about it. This is Trap Check. I'm Darren. Let's get into it. Alright, let's start with what Apple News actually is, because this matters. When Apple launched the News app in 2015, they made a deliberate and very public choice to not do what their competitors were doing. Facebook and Google had built algorithmic feeds that analyzed our behavior on their platforms. It identified what would get us to click and share more, what would get us to emotionally respond, and then gave us more of that. The logic was clean. Give people what they engage with and the engagement will go up. The problem was what people engage with. It turned out the most reliable way to generate engagement was fear, outrage, and tribalism. Algorithms didn't create those tendencies, they just discovered them and optimized around them. By 2016, the consequences of that optimization were visible enough that even the companies running it were getting a little uncomfortable. Apple watched all of this and made their pitch. We're different. We use humans, not machines. People curate our stories, not code. These are trained journalists who can do what an algorithm never can. They can apply judgment, consider context, and filter out the noise. Apple's chief of apps said at the time, we're not going to let it be total crazy land. That was the product promise, a sane and responsible feed, one that is curated by people who understand what journalism actually was. Well, what Apple didn't tell you, and what got very little coverage when the app launched, was who those people were. The team was led by a former executive editor of New York Magazine. The editors were drawn from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and Bloomberg. They were, almost without exception, products of the same institutional media ecosystem that Apple was positioning itself as an improvement on. The bylines may have changed, but the editorial culture didn't. Here's what that means in practice. Institutional culture isn't a conspiracy. It's the accumulated weight of what gets rewarded, what gets ignored, what counts as a credible source, what questions are worth asking. And when you hire 30 people from the same professional tradition, people that came from the same schools, the same newsrooms, and the same professional networks, you get 30 people who share a set of invisible assumptions about what normal looks like. They don't have to coordinate. They don't have to have meetings and scheme about which outlets to favor. They just make independent decisions that all trend in the same direction because they were all trained in the same direction. The Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal can both cover the same story with journalistic rigor and at the same time frame it differently, because the institutional assumptions about which voices matter, which angles deserve emphasis, which concerns are legitimate are different. Apple hired one tradition's understanding of rigor and called it neutrality. Is that malice, or is it just monoculture? It could be both. Well, here's where it gets structurally important. Apple has always acknowledged that its curation is human-driven. That's not hidden, it's actually a selling point. Apple brags about it. What they've been considerably less transparent about is the mechanics of that curation when it comes to what doesn't get in, and what you and I see when we can't figure out how to turn off the damn notification. Publishers apply to be part of the Apple News. Apple reviews them. Apple decides who's in and who's out. And when the Media Research Center applied to have 2 of its publications included, Apple told them that they were, quote, no longer accepting unsolicited applications, which directly contradicts what their own website says in plain English. Apple's public messaging says something like, we support a thriving news ecosystem. Publishers can apply to be a part of it. Apple's actual behavior when a conservative outlet tried to apply was, we're not taking any new applications, so pound sand. The feed was never open. It was curated from the beginning, curated at the intake level before a single story ever got selected. The bias isn't in which stories get chosen, it's in which voices are allowed to compete for the choosing. That's a different kind of problem, and it's the kind that doesn't show up in a study counting left versus right articles, because it operates upstream of the counting. Here's where the product starts lying. Apple's public position on this has been consistent. Users can customize their feed. You can follow the sources you want, block the ones you don't, and Apple News will learn your preferences over time. Apple seems to be clear about what the News app does. They say the app gives you control over your information environment. But that's not quite accurate. What Apple doesn't tell users all that clearly is that editor-curated content operates on a separate track from your personalization settings. When Apple's editorial team selects a story for top placement, that placement happens whether you want to see it or not. You can block a source, and stories from that source can still appear in your feed if an editor chooses for them to. Well, that means you have settings. Those settings feel like they give you control over what you don't want to read. Apple creates the experience of personal agency on its app. But underneath those settings, a team of 30 editors are making decisions that override your choices in the settings anyway. You and I don't know these people or their backgrounds. They have editorial standards we've never been shown. The settings aren't lying to us exactly. Our personal feed is real, but there's a layer above it that you can't control and don't see, and it accounts for the most prominent placements in the app. Ponder that for a second, because this is the method being used to undermine our control, and it's sitting underneath most of what we're talking about. When you interact with an interface that gives you controls, your brain categorizes that interface as responsive. You turned the knob did something. What it doesn't tell you is that the knob controls the bass, but someone else controls whether the song plays at all. You don't get the play and stop buttons. This is a specific kind of design decision, and it is absolutely intentional. The field of user experience, or UX design, has spent decades learning exactly how interface controls affect the feeling of personal agency. Giving people knobs and sliders and preference toggles, even when those controls have limited actual impact, still increases satisfaction with the product. It increases trust. It decreases the likelihood that someone will ask, what's going on underneath all this? The settings on Apple News aren't exactly a lie. They do something, but what they do is restricted to a layer of the app that operates below the featured stories section. The morning news part, you're managing your personal feed. That part is real. The algorithm that learns what topics you follow and what sources you've subscribed to and what you've saved or shared does in fact respond to you. The editorial layer doesn't. That's the featured stories section, the morning news, the top 10 or whatever it's called. It responds to the judgment of the curators, and the curators don't know you. They weren't hired to represent you, and they have no method for accountability to you. They don't care about you, the reader. They were hired to produce what Apple considers quality journalism. Quality in this context means whatever a team of legacy media editors chooses. Apple built an interface that feels like a neutral information utility. It looks clean, customizable, trustworthy. Underneath that look and feel, Apple built an editorial operation that functions more like a publication than a news aggregator. The presentation is one thing, but the architecture is another. For most of the app's history, this didn't generate much controversy because the editorial choices were broadly aligned with what the mainstream media establishment considered reasonable. The feed felt neutral to people who shared the assumptions of the people who were building it. That's not a conspiracy, that's just how institutional culture works. The editors weren't running a covert operation, they were making the calls their training and background prepared them to make. And they did it in an environment with no external check on those calls. What changed in 2026 wasn't Apple's behavior. What changed was that someone else started counting. The Media Research Center built a tracking tool. They call it the Digital News Tracker. And they started systematically monitoring what Apple News, Google News, MSN, and Yahoo News were surfacing in their top stories every morning. And what they found for Apple News in January of this year was 620 top stories. 440 of those stories were from outlets that were rated as left-leaning. The rest were from center outlets. 0, not a handful, not a token few, but literally actually 0 stories came from right-leaning outlets over a 30-day period. They extended that window and found that it had actually been 100 consecutive days without a single right-leaning story in the morning top 20. 100 days! So here's a little context for you. The MRC uses All Sides media bias ratings to do their categorization. All Sides rates The Washington Post, Associated Press, NBC News, NPR, and The New York Times as left-leaning. They rate The Wall Street Journal and Reuters as center. Right-leaning by their ratings includes Fox News, of course, The New York Post, The Daily Mail, Breitbart, and The Gateway Pundit. You can have some opinions about that categorization. Some of those outlets on the right end of that list are genuinely not in the same credibility tier as, the Wall Street Journal. But that's not really the point. The point is that when you map Apple's editorial choices against any consistent bias rating, the distribution is not random. The Wall Street Journal is a high credibility outlet, and it showed up in center, not right. Fox News has credibility issues on some coverage, just like most of these other news outlets, and it is rated as right. But there are serious outlets in that right-leaning tier, and they were completely absent for 100 days. Here's something interesting about that 100-day window specifically. And it didn't end because Apple changed its approach, it ended the day after the FTC letter. On February 12th, the day after a federal agency formally warned Apple that its curation might be deceptive, Apple's editors selected a Fox News digital story about an actor's death. That was the first right-leaning story in 100 days. The death of an actor? Well, why not a political story? Or how about a policy story? Nope, no stories that would require Apple's editors to grapple with a conservative framing on a contested issue. A celebrity obituary from a right-leaning outlet. That is what Apple considers the compromise position. To include the least politically consequential content possible. Just enough to get the number off of 0. 2% by the end of February. MRC President David Bozell said the quiet thing out loud. 2% is not progress, it's damage control. He's right, damage control is its own kind of data. It tells you and me that the organization understood what it was doing, or at a minimum understood how it looked, and their response was calibrated to minimize exposure rather than address the actual bias. Here's the piece people are missing in how they're reacting to this data though. The 100-day number is striking, but it's downstream of a structural problem that existed before the counting even started. The counting revealed the output, it didn't reveal the design. Apple's editorial team, which is drawn from the legacy media, operates without external accountability. They make thousands of decisions a year about what 125 million people read in the morning. For the entire existence of the app, those decisions have skewed in a direction that tracked closely to the beliefs and worldviews of the team that promotes that content. That result of the 100-day case study wasn't a stated Apple policy. It was the natural result of a hiring pool and an editorial culture that didn't include the perspectives that would have noticed that gap. This is the thing that gets lost in the left versus right framing. The problem isn't that liberal editors are running a secret liberal operation. The problem is that any 30-person editorial team that is drawn from any political side or single institutional background that operates without accountability will fail a neutrality test when curating content for 125 million people. The ideology almost doesn't matter. The architecture of how it was formed in the first place, that's the issue. If you lined up 30 editors exclusively from conservative media and gave them the same system, you'd have a mirror image of the same problem but in the opposite direction. People have been building these kinds of systems for a very long time. A select few decide what the many can see, dressed in the language of service and responsibility. There's nothing new about this method. But what is new is the scale and the invisibility of it. When a medieval church decided which texts were canonical and which were heretical, the authority was at least visible. You knew who was making the call. When Apple does it, it looks like a clean, white interface with customization settings that feel like choices you and I can make for ourselves. The mechanism is older than the internet, but the disguise is new. The FTC under Chairman Andrew Ferguson sent a warning letter to Tim Cook in February. The letter argued that if Apple News markets itself as neutral but applies an ideological filter, it may be violating Section 5 of the FTC Act, the prohibition on unfair or deceptive practices. Ferguson's argument is essentially, you told consumers you were offering a balanced curation of news, but you weren't, and the gap between the promise and the practice is potentially fraud. It's a clever argument, and the underlying problem that it's addressing is that Apple is promising one thing and delivering another. That part's real. But the FTC chairman is using consumer protection law to pressure a private company about its editorial choices. That's a First Amendment problem, full stop. The FTC is not the free speech police. Ferguson even said those words in this letter. But a government agency sending a formal warning letter to a company about the ideological content of its editorial decisions, well, that's basically government pressure on those editorial choices. This frames the problem as consumer protection, but it doesn't change the mechanism. If the concern is really about deceptive trade practices, the remedy is transparency. Force Apple to disclose that its feed is editorially curated with a specific institutional background. That's the consumer protection fix. What the letter actually does is create a regulatory pressure to change the political balance of the editorial output. Those are different things. And here's the trap inside the trap. The people who are most upset about Apple's bias, the same people who spent months documenting it, are genuinely right that there's a structural problem here. And many of them are cheering for a government agency to pressure a private company's editorial decisions. They're upset that a powerful institution like Apple is shaping the information environment without accountability. Their solution is to hand a different powerful institution, i.e. the government, the authority to correct it. Now that's not a solution to the problem of concentrated informational power in this case. That's just a transfer of it. So what does that mean? There's a version of this that's easy to miss because the emotional logic feels satisfying. Apple was biased. The government has started to push back. Apple added more content from conservative outlets. That feels like accountability, right? That means the system is working, right? Well, here's the problem. If the FTC can pressure Apple to include more right-leaning content under the current administration, a future FTC under a different administration can pressure a different company to include more left-leaning content. The legal theory that Ferguson is building right now, that a platform's editorial choices can be challenged as a deceptive trade practice when they don't match their own neutrality claims, that doesn't belong to one political party. It's a general-purpose tool. You don't get to like the tool when your team is holding it and object to it when the other team picks it up. The tool is just a tool, and right now someone is building a precedent that every future administration will inherit. What's actually being debated in this story isn't left versus right. It's not really even Apple versus us, the consumer. It's a deeper question about who gets to control the information environment at scale, and whether the answer to private editorial power is government regulatory power or something else entirely. The something else is a little harder. It requires people like you and me to understand what these platforms actually are and make deliberate choices about how we use them. It requires media literacy at a scale that doesn't really exist. It doesn't have a villain that you can write and send a letter to. But the easy move, which is to use the government to force the balance, That has a cost that gets paid for later by someone else under different political conditions, but they use the exact precedent being set right now. So what now? Okay, let's put the layers down cleanly. Layer 1, Apple News does not aggregate news neutrally. It never was. It was built from day one as a curated product that was staffed almost entirely by people from legacy media institutions. These people have the controls that determine which voices can even compete for a placement. The neutrality was always a presentation layer, but not a real option throughout the app. Apple advertised the human curation as the killer feature, but what they didn't advertise was the homogeneity of the humans doing the curating. Layer 2. The user controls in the app are real but limited. There is a personalization layer that you can actually adjust, but there's an editorial layer above it that operates regardless of what your settings are. The interface communicates that you and I have personal agency, decision-making authority in the app, but what the settings deliver is actually a lot more narrow. You have a real knob, you just can't reach the board that it's connected to. Layer 3. The data from the MRC is real and the problem it documents is real, but the data reveals the output, not the design. The 100-day number is the symptom. The monoculture of the editorial staff that produced it is the condition. Counting the articles tells you that something happened. It doesn't tell you why the system was intentionally built to allow it to happen without anyone noticing for years. And Layer 4. The FTC response addresses a genuine problem through a mechanism that creates a different problem. Government pressure on editorial decisions doesn't become acceptable just because the editorial decisions being pressured on are genuinely biased. The principle doesn't have partisan exemptions. The legal theory being built right now on how to fix a conservative grievance will be the same legal theory that'll be deployed against conservative media under different political conditions in the future. That's not hypothetical, that's how precedent works. Here's the broader question that this story is actually asking. We built a media ecosystem where a handful of platforms like Apple, Google, Meta, and a few others basically function as the primary information environment for most of the country. These platforms make editorial and polar choices constantly. They decide what surfaces and what gets suppressed, what looks credible and what gets a label. Those choices compound over time and shape how tens of millions of people see and understand what happens in the world today. The people that are making these decisions, they're not accountable to the people that they're making them for, you and me. They're accountable to a faceless class of shareholders. Every once in a while, they're accountable to regulators, and rarely are they accountable to public pressure, but they are never accountable to you and me. This whole thing isn't unique to Apple News. Apple News just happens to be where some people started doing some counting. The uncomfortable but honest question is not, why is Apple biased? The actual question is, why do we assume any of them aren't biased? Every platform that presents itself as a neutral conduit for information is making editorial choices. Every algorithm that decides what you see next is applying the values of whoever wrote the optimization function in the first place, whoever defined the training data, whoever decided what relevant and quality mean in this system. All these trending sections and everyone's recommended feed, every preloaded iPhone app, all of it is the result of decisions made by people whose names we don't know, whose backgrounds we've never examined, operating without meaningful accountability to you and me. When Google's algorithm decides which stories surface for a search term, that's an editorial choice. When a social media feed decides which posts from your friends or friends of friends get shown and which ones get buried, that's also an editorial choice. None of these are made by you and me. None are disclosed in any meaningful way, but all of them are intended to shape how we understand our world. Apple News is actually distinct from its competitors in one important way. They admitted that there were humans making the calls. They dropped the algorithm pretense. That transparency is what made the counting possible in the first place. You can't audit what an algorithm is hiding, but you can count what 30 editors are choosing. So in a strange way, the MRC study was only possible because Apple was more honest than Google or Meta about how they curate stories. The irony of that is probably not lost on their PR team right now. This Apple News story isn't really all that surprising. What is surprising is that anyone thought the alternative could be true. Here's what a non-captured person does with all this information. Treat the curated feeds like Apple News as they really are. One perspective presented as a window. Not a window into reality, a window into what a specific set of people with a specific institutional background decided you should see this morning. Build your information diet on your own terms. Do it intentionally, across sources with different institutional assumptions, different funding models, different audiences. Read people that you disagree with, not so that you can eventually change your mind about things, but to understand the argument before you talk to the people who have the same argument out here in the real world. A person's claim that arrives without opposition has almost certainly been pre-filtered. When something makes you feel certain about a thing, treat that certainty as a prompt to look harder at it, not a signal to stop looking. A certainty delivered efficiently is usually a certainty that's been engineered. Real understanding is slower and messier. And watch who you hand the remedy to. The person offering to fix your information environment on your behalf has an information environment of their own that they're optimizing for. The FTC chairman who's concerned about your access to balanced news is also a political appointee with a political agenda. That's not an attack on him. It's just a description of what every person in that role is and what they do by default. The tool he's building to fix the bias problem you're upset about is the same tool someone else will pick up later and use differently. Now, none of this is cynicism. It's just pattern recognition. And it's the only defense against the mechanism that works on both sides of the aisle with equal efficiency. You've been listening to Trap Check. The feed is curated. It always has been. Now you know who's doing it and why the government can't solve it. Okay, I'll see you next week.